Hello, Lidgewood. Welcome to the reading for week 19. So this is April 30 through May 6, and it is 2 Samuel 5 through 6, 1 Chronicles 11 through 16, and then Psalms 102 through 104, 133, 106, and 107, 1 through 2, 15, 22 through 24, 47, 68, 89, 96, 100, 101, 105, and 132. So there's a lot of David's reflections, um, and I think maybe a little bit of other people's reflections as well on some of the stuff that's happening. Actually kind of a lot happening in these stories because there's some pretty condensed versions in both Second Samuel and First Chronicles of the same stories. And so what we'll see here is where these are actually going to parallel one another quite a lot. So just to start off, in Second Samuel 5 slash First Chronicles 11, we have the coronation of David as king over all Israel. So pay attention to how they describe their relationship with David, especially now that Saul and his son Ishbosheth are dead. So what are they just like now remembering about David, after all these years? How did God prepare the way for David? It's very interesting to me because in a lot of ways, David is like an upfront example for all of Israel of God's faithfulness to one man, because really his life has been lived so in public that people have known for years about God's promises that he was going to be king, about the ways that God was going to do all of these things for him, and just even the fact that he was anointed, that came to be known. And then the people have seen over the years how Saul has pursued him and about how he's really had to be on the run, and then ultimately how God has also fulfilled his promises to David after all of that. So to me, it's really interesting in some ways to think about the way that David has been a bit of an object lesson for Israel in terms of God's faithfulness. What do you think Israel learned from, God's faithfulness to David out there in public where people could see it? We also see that everything that's happened to David so far has happened to a man who is under 30 years old. So he's 30 when he is crowned at Hebron and then crowned as king over all of Judah and all of Israel, the whole land. He's already lived for 7 years in Hebron. And so he's 30. So this means everything that's happened to him has happened to a man under 30. So what kind of observations can we make about him in light of his age? I mean, most of us at this point are over 30. And so you think about yourself at 30 and under, if you had had the kind of life experiences that David had, how would that have gone for you? What kind of a person would you have been? What kind of a person would you be now? It's kind of interesting to reflect on in terms of his age. You think about the two opportunities that he had to kill Saul and why he didn't. Think about the years of running and all of the stress and even the grief, the betrayal he would have felt. Even the killing of Goliath and the subsequent betrothal to Saul's daughter, which, probably happened when he was a teenager. That's a lot to carry around. And you think about, too, what kind of impulse control would it take for David not to react to Saul every time Saul tried to kill David? What does this teach us about his faith? What was God doing inside of him in the middle of all of these circumstances? And where did that really even come from? I think there's a lot to be said for when he comes to kill Goliath and he says, I've been a shepherd this whole time and God has protected me and God has delivered lions and bears into my hand. Here's someone who's had a relationship with God from when he was young and also been deeply reflective about God himself and who God has been for him. This is pretty interesting. Here in this story, we also get the full span of David's reign. So 7 years in Hebron, then 33 years over all Israel, reigning from Jerusalem. So this is going to be the heart of Israel's golden age. I'm sorry, he was 30 at the beginning of his 7 years in Hebron. Yeah, I was wrong there. So he's going to live and reign till he's 70. But this is going to be the heart of Israel's golden age and what they're going to look back to for years to come. At this time, we see the taking of Jerusalem. And it's interesting because the Jebusites still live there. And this date is basically 1003 BC. So Israel's already been in the land about 400 years. So what has not happened that should have happened by now? We also see that this was a people group that God had mentioned in Genesis 15:21 when he talked to Abraham about the nations he was going to judge and then deliver the land into their hands. The Jebusites were mentioned by God 1,000 years before this as under his judgment. And we also can see a little bit of like, how did we get to be this way in Joshua 15:63 and then Judges 1:21. So that's good for reflection. Just what's going on here? Here's this sort of lingering evidence of Israel's disobedience toward the Lord and then David being brought in to set it right. It's also moving toward the completion of Deuteronomy 12 when God says he's going to establish a place for his name. And so he's opening up Jerusalem because Jerusalem will be the place for his name. We're going to see a little bit more about that in next week's reading. We also get two slightly different narratives about the taking of Jerusalem. So Chronicles gives us more information about who took the city, Joab, and then why Joab has such prominence. And then Second Samuel tells us actually how he did it. So he like climbed up the water shaft, which it would have been a feat in itself to like climb up a water shaft and invade the city via water shaft. Get through the wall and then like smite people left and right. There's also really interesting internal commentary here about the lame and the blind, despised by David, and that's in 2 Samuel 5:6-8. That's going to be interesting in light of 2 Samuel 9, so just keep that in your pocket for next week's reading. 1 Chronicles 11-12 also starts and ends with the crowning of David in Hebron, and in the middle it traces stories of David's mighty men. So it gives their ranks, their military strength, some stories about what they actually did. And so again, this is very much Israel's golden age, and I suspect this is why the chronicler is focusing on the deeds of astounding bravery by great warriors. I would almost compare this to Camelot, except for the fact that we have a lot more evidence for the reign of David, a lot more like accurate historical evidence for the reign of David than we do for the reign of King Arthur. And so this passage also directly parallels 2 Samuel 23:8-39. So we're going to see these mighty men pop up again later in the reading. But this is definitely a moment when, later writers are focusing very heavily on the glory of the kingdom under David. A couple of observations about the mighty men. Uriah the Hittite's one of them. That's 1141. He's most famous for being married to Bathsheba. So this isn't going to go well. That's going to pop up next week too. We also see a lot of Saul's family actually joining David when he was still in Ziklag. So that's in 12:1-7. Why do you think so much of Saul's family joined up with David at Ziklag? It's interesting. He also gets a lot of recruits from the tribe of Gad, which lived across the Jordan and may have been less connected to Saul. So that's 12:8-15. And then he ends up eventually with 120,000 soldiers in his kingdom after he's crowned from across the Jordan. That's in 12:37. He seems to unify Israel a lot more than Saul did. I'm also very interested in the fact that there was sort of a warring squad of Levites, that's 12:26-28, since they weren't really supposed to serve as people of war. But some of them are going to pop up later in the story as well and in more of a covert capacity. So we're going to see that with Zadok, and that will be in the time of Absalom. So for the story of the breakout against Uzzah, which is kind of next in the narrative, and then later on there's going to be a successful transfer of the Ark of God to Jerusalem about 3 months later. 2 Samuel 6 is a very concise version of that, and then 1 Chronicles 13, 15, and 16 expand it. So they have a lot more details about the priests who participated, a lot less detail about Michal and the drama with Michal. And then it also in 1 Chronicles includes a David Psalm of Praise, which could either be a compilation of 105, 106, and then 96, or Psalms 105, 106, and 96 could be, like offshoots from this psalm. So it's also kind of interesting to see, what was David's process for writing psalms? He seems to have taken some psalms and like really liked that part and like, I'm gonna put that in a new psalm, build a psalm around it. It's just interesting in thinking about his psalm writing. So it is worth taking time to compare these two narratives of the transfer of the Ark of the Lord. Again, we're sort of in that trajectory of moving towards a place for God's name. And so that's really where a lot of this story is going. Deuteronomy 12 says God's going to establish a place for his name. That's where Israel's going to worship. And we haven't seen that happen yet. So the ark has been in different places. And then the tabernacle of God has been in different places, separate from the ark. It's just kind of been a mess. And so we're moving in the narrative towards moving the ark eventually up to Jerusalem. And then eventually there's going to be the temple that's built in Jerusalem, that place for God's name, which is going to be the heart of Israel. And so then in 2 Samuel 5 and then 1 Chronicles 14, we also get introduced to David's relationship with Hiram, king of Tyre. He's going to show up again in the narrative as well, both with David and with Solomon. So remember that name. He actually builds David a house, which is really neat. So I think it's kind of interesting because we see early on in David's reign, God is providing for him through relationships, and their relationships even with another king, who is just very generously disposed toward David. What an act of the favor of God. I also just really think it's very interesting because we're going to see this as a continued relationship that's going to last a couple of generations, and how God, we don't know where this relationship started, but like God obviously gave David favor with Hiram, king of Tyre, and Hiram is going to be a big part eventually of the building of the temple. So that's really cool. We see that popping up here. We can also see that David is continuing to collect women, not just as wives, but also as concubines now. So we're not just going to have legitimate wives with legitimate children, we're going to have concubines with illegitimate children. And so David is thoroughly living now like, an ancient Near Eastern sovereign. He's collecting a harem, he has concubines. So he now has 11 legitimate sons in Jerusalem, in addition to the 6 sons who were born in Hebron. And we ought to be thinking in this about previous stories of polygamy where they turned out badly. Jacob had all these kids from all these different women, and they hated one another. There were rivalries because they didn't have that loyalty to one another. It's like their father's one flesh union was like split among multiple women, which just doesn't work. And so we should be seeing this, like every time this pops up in the narrative, we should be thinking there's going to be some pretty serious conflict that's coming from this. And so, just keep watching, it's going to come out. We also see that David ends up with 2 victories over the Philistines. That's in 1 Chronicles 14, 8 through 17, and then 2 Samuel 5, 17 through 25. So what do these 2 victories teach us about God? What do they teach us about knowing God's will? What do we see David doing or not doing between these 2 victories? It's just kind of interesting the way that the Lord is leading him at this time. So just some observations about the reading. In many ways, David's reign, and then later on, Solomon's building of the temple is going to be sort of an extension of David's reign at this point. This is the height of Israel's history. For the rest of their history as a nation, they're going to reflect back on this moment of unity, strength, victory, religious cohesion. They're going to long for a king like David. So much of what we can see in these stories is that David actually has to point to a better king, because even though he is in so many ways the embodiment of Israel's hopes and dreams, he's imperfect, and he has to point to the true hope of Israel. And we really see also in this time of his early reign, he really does in a lot of ways point to the true king of Israel, because we can see how different he is from Saul. Saul was not interested in investing in the next generation at all. He wasn't interested in setting anybody else up for success. And David very much is. Saul was not interested in sharing fame or power, and David very much is, because you can see this development of these mighty men where he's giving them power and influence, which could be a threat to him, but he's doing it because he's a man of God, really. And so he's not afraid to share the things that God has given to him. He invests in them. We see also that he's genuinely brokenhearted at the willingness they have to take risks for him. That's in 1 Chronicles 11, 15 through 19, which is the story of the water from the well at Bethlehem. Just David's response to the way that these men express their loyalty. We also see him dependent on God for wisdom in battle in the story of the 2 battles against the Philistines. And we see him able to learn from his mistakes and go back to God's word in his treatment of the ark. We also see his passion to worship God as he dances before God with all his might when the ark reaches Jerusalem. And we see his investment in setting the next generation up for success by establishing a clear religious order for Israel. So it makes sense that later generations would reflect on this moment. Here was this king that really gave himself to make his people successful. So we see a lot of this early in his reign. David he's not just one thing, he's a really complex man. We also see on sort of the lower end of this, the continued creep of collecting women that's coming into his life. And then also we can see his harshness toward Michal in 2 Samuel 6, 16 through 23. That's a really complex story. A lot's going on in it, but it does remind us that we still do need a better king than David. So he may be Israel's best, most faithful king, but he has to point to the king to come. And I think it's just the grace of the Lord that, in Hebrews, it talks about how like all of these people lived without seeing God's promises come to pass because God didn't intend to make them perfect apart from us. That in another place, I can't think of where it is, but it talks about how like kings and prophets have desired to look in, Jesus says, have desired to look into the things that are happening and they haven't seen it, but then Jesus has actually revealed it to us. And so we can see here that, Israel had to look for a better king. And when we look at David's life, and he was the best they ever had, and then he's still a very imperfect person. And so that always should be pointing us to David couldn't be the hope of Israel. The hope of Israel is Jesus Christ. They just didn't know it yet. It was God himself come to live among them and be the king on the throne of David. And we are so blessed to be able to know that and to know the king that he sits on the throne of David, the king who is forever. Is our King Jesus, who is never going to disappoint us and never going to do anything wrong. He's always perfect. So that should just be an encouragement to us as we reflect on this. And yeah, I hope you guys have enjoyed this.